Well, let me start out with driving donkeys in public. That's something when I got my draft horses back in '86, I wanted to be able to drive animals in public. I did it some with the draft horses, but it wasn't nearly as successful as my donkeys. As far as how the public response has been overwhelmingly positive. I have people lean out their car windows and yell at me, "You've got the right idea." Most of what I see in cars as I drive around is the lens side of cell phones. There's gotta be 10,000 videos of me driving donkeys floating around Ray County. Um, and old people especially, I talk to old men who remember were children during the horse and buggy days,
Mm,
and I often hear, "We we're better off then," and I
mm.
agree with that. Change it. I think one of the biggest things that modern people don't realize is the extent to which their speed, the ability to produce surface speeds, defines the scales of their life.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDIF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Truth and Reckoning. We have a very interesting show for you today. It's an interview that I conducted with a man named Jeff McFadden. Jeff lives in Missouri in a rural area where he came to my attention because he, as much as possible, uses a pair of donkeys and a cart to get around rather than a car. Now, a lot of people would perceive this as just some sort of anachronism, but Jeff pairs this, personal choice with a very astute, sharp political analysis. He is a critic of empire, of ecological collapse, of the use of fossil fuels that's driving ecological collapse and climate catastrophe. And a lot of his work focuses on the importance of slowing down, of speed as one of the key drivers and features of modern global industrial society. And he uses a speed as a proxy, as a way to talk about all the issues that speed enables. Massive fuel consumption, transportation for industry and commerce around the planet, and the pollution and destruction of habitats and degradation of human life that occurs as a result of that speed. So it's a very, very interesting conversation. Jeff is a fascinating man. He's also involved in restoring the land where he lives. We talk about all these topics and much more. We talk about his writing. He's a writer, putting out essays quite regularly on these issues. And we conclude, or we wrap up the conversation by talking about the issue of collapse. Because if we define sustainability as the ability of a system or a society to continue indefinitely, then living in an unsustainable society means that by definition it will not last. So the question is, how do we change that? How do we change course? And that's really what we dive into at the end of this conversation. It's a fascinating one. Jeff is a gem, a wonderful human being doing fascinating work, not just involved in a personal change project, but really trying to change the world in very important ways. So enjoyed the conversation. Let's get right into it. Jeff, well, thank you for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time to talk. And I'm curious if you could just get started by telling me a little bit of your background. And I don't know much about your history. I know a little bit about the work that you do, but I'm curious about how you, like, what your trajectory was that got you to where you are today in relation to slowing down and the things that you write about.
Well, I grew up in Kansas City. I'm your typical boomer kid. I was born in 47, and I was just your typical boomer. I drove hot rod cars and lived the modern life as it was until I reached the age of 37. And by that time, I was depressed and dissatisfied with the life I lived, and I bought 40 acres in Ray County, Missouri, and moved.
Mhm.
Didn't really have a plan except I wanted to live someplace where every time I went outside, I could see green stuff.
Mhm.
And then my other plan, and it was the plan from the beginning, was to try to manage that piece of ground so that it would become a wildlife refuge. What my word. It was a 40-acre hill farm, badly degraded by modern, or annual agriculture methods.
Mhm.
Uh, that was 1985.
Mhm.
Uh, about 80, I was still commuting to Kansas City, which was 50 miles one way.
Mhm.
So, and then I drove during my work too, so I was driving about 50,000 miles a year.
Mhm.
And uh, after about a year, I came to the conclusion that the worst invention in world history was the automobile. By the way, I still maintain that position. So I didn't know. I mean, I was a city kid. I didn't know how to do any of this stuff. I was just
Yeah.
picking it up as I went along. But I went up to where the Amish live, and I bought a team of old draft horses, and I let them teach me how to work with animals, the horses that is. And time went by, and at some point, I realized that everything that I could do for wildlife would also feed humans. Basically, we think we're so different, but we live on the same stuff they all do.
Mhm.
The every tree will feed a squirrel, will feed a turkey, will feed a human, and
Mhm.
so forth. You know, um, so my views evolved slowly, and I just kept doing the things that I did. At some point, I realized that I didn't have enough work
Mhm.
to keep draft horses sharp. They're too big and they're too powerful, and most of the work I had was small and modest, and I just couldn't keep them sharp. So I sold my draft horses and eventually wound up buying donkeys because they're small and they're modest, and you can use them for everything. They'll just walk with you and do whatever you want. And I mean, I've watched the world slowly die. Three-quarters of all the wildlife on Earth has been killed off in my own personal lifetime. In fact, in my adult life. And so more and more as time went by, I started working to try to combat that just on my little spot. Back in 2004, well, back the wife that moved out to the country with me got tired of my ways, and I can't blame her. So she moved out in 1995, and in 2004, I married a woman who owned this farm where I live now. Moved off my old farm, but it was paid for, so I didn't sell it. I just moved off of it, and I came over here and started working this farm with my new wife's help and cooperation. Then she died in 2020 of pancreatic cancer. So by that time, I was about 75, and things were getting harder, and I was alone.
Mhm.
So as it evolved, I hired a couple of young women to do the work here for me. I left this out in the story, but I fought in Vietnam. I was drafted and was in the infantry, and I fought there, and I'm a 100% disabled veteran.
Mhm.
So that left me with some income, which and I had that farm was paid for, and my wife had paid this one off before I married her, so I had two paid for farms and some income. So I gave one of the farms away to a young woman, a single mother with a at that time 5-year-old daughter. She's 7 years old now, and she's in the back room here.
Mhm.
Then I later employed that woman to manage this farm for me, as well as live on that one, and then employed another woman to help her. But basically, it's just been a slow process of observing how this land wants to grow things, what it
Mm,
wants to grow, and how to select from those things native plants which would provide food for both we humans and all the other creatures that live here. And it's just been a solution. So, I still drive a car, although I hate it. I dream every day of getting to the point where all I have to drive is my donkeys and I don't have to drive this plastic car anymore. But it's hard to fully unwind yourself from this culture. And especially if you don't have a lot of help. The reason the Amish system works is because they have each other.
yeah.
And the reason they maintained that system was so they would have each other. The Amish say, we need our neighbors and you need your neighbor's farm. And
Mhm.
so with the young women that I've employed here, we're a 5-person community. Myself, I've remarried my elderly wife, the 2 young women and the 7-year-old daughter. But we're still trying to bring in more people. We all drive animals to do all the work we're able to do. And if we can't do them with animals, we do them with the smallest possible machine. The objective is to do all the work with the minimum possible amount of energy that will complete the task.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where we are now.
So thanks for that background, Jeff. I'm curious now because you're in Missouri, right? And I'm just wondering, I've never been there. I don't know anything about the ecology of that region really at all. And I'm sure many of the folks who are going to listen to this and watch this don't either. So can you describe for a little bit the land? You said the original farm was a hill farm that was badly degraded. What's that land looking like now, 41 years later, and the place that you're on now? What's the ecological succession process that's going on that you're assisting with?
This land, when the white people got here, this land was oak savanna.
Mhm.
It wasn't a forest just because of fire. A savanna is essentially a fire ecosystem. The fires start anywhere in the grassland and they will go. This is all quite hilly ground. The other farm, 5 to 9% slope, in excess of 90% eroded. This farm here is very much the same. The white people got here with their plows in 1830 and they plowed it until 1930. Well, until World War One or two, and then after the war they came back and plowed it again. So there's not much topsoil left here. But historically, it was a savanna. And so what we do is we manage it as a savanna. I've been planting trees every spring. The Missouri Conservation Department sells bare rooted seedlings very reasonably, and you can buy bundles of 10 or bundles of 25. And I don't even know anymore. We've got 150 plus bought to plant this spring. That'll be in 2 weeks. We'll be getting those and planting them. But we plant them in a savanna style. I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Shepard and his work, but I follow a lot of his teachings. And one of the major things is to capture water and soak it into the ground. So we survey along the contours, and then we dig basically ditches, what we call swales, along those contours so that as the water runs down, it gets caught and it doesn't run downhill in these because they're parallel to or perpendicular to gravity. Um, and then we plant our trees on the downhill sides of them. And then to maintain the savanna appearance, we largely manage with mowing. We do what we call chop and drop mowing. We use a 25 horsepower machine and mow, and we mow this part, and then we mow that part, and then we don't mow that part. So all the parts are in different stages of succession throughout the season. And so we've always got some place for the bees to live, and we've always got some place for the birds to live. But the grass, as we drop it, surface compost, it rots away. And so the ground itself now holds more water, and then the swales hold more water. None of the things we've planted here are bearing to a significant amount yet, except the elderberries, but we're within a year or two of getting results from our native hazelnuts. As I said, everything we plant, the only thing we plant here that's not native is Asian chestnuts. And that, of course, is because the American chestnut has been horribly damaged by the blight. And there is a movement afoot to breed blight-resistant American chestnuts, but that's a complete life project, and it's not mine. So we plant Asian chestnuts, and aside from that, we plant native fruit bearing, nut bearing, and root crop things, to get the most yield that we can, the most habitat that we can create for the wild creatures, and the most, I have felt all my adult life that the machine we live within is going to collapse. So one of my objectives is that after the machine collapses, and of course I'm now 78, so after I collapse, that there's something here to keep this community, provide this community with food, drinkable water, and way to live.
I actually live in an oak savanna area myself in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And prior to the arrival of settler colonists, Europeans in this area, who not only interrupted the natural fire regimes, but introduced large-scale annual agriculture and plowed most of the savanna, cut down most of the old oak trees, and completely changed the ecological conditions here. But the acorns from the oak trees here were a staple food source historically. There's actually quite an old oak tree right behind me here. I'm sitting in a little park, and I've been involved to a small degree. I don't own land or steward land or whatever term you want to say, but I've been involved to a small extent in doing some similar work in this area. So it's quite interesting to hear about that. There are a lot of questions that I have for you, Jeff. I'm curious about, maybe I'll throw a couple out to you and you can take this in any direction that you want. I'm curious to talk about the way that you use your donkeys. You said that you still drive a car. I know you use your donkeys on the farm, but I also know that sometimes you take them into town. You use them to run your errands, go to the grocery store, go to the other places that you need to go to. And I'm curious about that, both the logistics of how that works for you, the shift to that, how people respond to it, and the work that you've been doing in the arena of transportation to try to get people to slow down. And I'm also curious about the results in terms of wildlife, birds, insects, perhaps carbon storage or soil, the other things that might have responded to your work on these farms so far. So either of those questions, I'm not sure which direction you want to take it.
Well, let me start out with driving donkeys in public. That's something, when I got my draft horses back in '86, I wanted to be able to drive animals in public. I did it some with the draft horses, but it wasn't nearly as successful as my donkeys. As far as how the public responds, the public response has been overwhelmingly positive. I have people lean out their car windows and yell at me, "You've got the right idea." Most of what I see in cars as I drive around is the lens side of cell phones. There's got to be 10,000 videos of me driving donkeys floating around Ray County. Um, and old people especially. I talk to old men who remember were children during the horse and buggy days, and I often hear we were better off then, and I agree with that. Change. I think one of the biggest things that modern people don't realize is the extent to which their speed, the ability to produce surface speeds, defines the scales of their life. I can go out there, get in my car, drive to Richmond. I can be there in like 10 or 11 minutes. If I harness up both the girls when we go at a walk, it's going to take me 2.5 hours. If I harness up Missy by herself, my larger and older donkey of my two trained ones, and put her on the doctor's buggy, which is very light, and she can trot all the way to town pulling the doctor's buggy, we can make it in about an hour. Typically, if I'm going to do a bunch of shopping, I'm going to go to the grocery store. I'm going to go probably to the hardware store. I'm going to go to the farm supply store. I'm going to buy bags of chicken feed and bags of corn and things that are heavy. I also take them. I never take recyclables to the recycle point in a car. It strikes me as profoundly wasteful to burn gasoline to recycle things. So I would save up all my recyclables until I'm going to make a donkey trip, and then I take them to the recycle. All told, day trip to Richmond is about a 16-mile round trip from
Mhm.
from here to places in Richmond that I go and back to here, and
Mhm.
typically that takes about 5 6 hours. Um, if I go to Kansas City, which is where all the big money is, all the major services in the car, well, that's going to be 5 or 6 hours. So it tells you the difference in scale. As far as doing it, it's one of the reasons that it's so scary. Of course, is the cars are so horrendously dangerous. They kill 40,000 Americans a year, and I'm out there in a donkey cart that will go at absolute maximum somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 miles an hour, and I'm on 55-mile-an-hour 2-lane blacktop highway, and uh, most people are very courteous. There are always a few jerks, but my girls have been passed by semi-trailer trucks. They've been passed by ambulances with their sirens running. They've been passed by Harley Davidson motorcycles and passed by morons in large pickup trucks with their foot on the floor. Typically, if somebody pulls up beside us and stops or slows to our speed, that frightens my girls more than somebody just roars by, because that thing right beside him might be a predator. But overall, I've become used to it. And we have, of course, slow moving vehicle emblems on the backs of our vehicles, and we have flashing lights on the backs of our vehicles. The Amish have developed a system whereby they use DeWalt 20-volt tool batteries to power the lights on their vehicles, and I've just imitated their system. I've remained, you can't do what I do, or it would be a lot harder to do what I do if you didn't have Amish people around. My closest Amish community is about 60 miles, so I don't see them all the time. But I can go up there and get things that I need. I can get in the car, the truck, and go up there and get things that I need. So as far as that, and it's just so pleasant. Particularly, there's two ways to get to Richmond from here. One is all gravel roads all the way, but it's over a mile farther. And the other one is a mile of gravel and then blacktop all the way. It's a lot easier for donkeys to trot on blacktop than it is on gravel, because the pebbles of the gravel hit the soles of their feet and are uncomfortable. Whereas when they trot on blacktop, their hook wall carries all their load. My donkeys get farrier care every 6 weeks. In fact, my farm manager is a farrier, so I don't have to go very far to get that. But anyway, as far as how we use them here, we don't do very much ground stirring. Mostly I try to keep the ground covered with grasses. But we do stir the ground a little. Part of it gets stirred because like we had to have some construction done here. My septic tank went bad, and I had to have somebody come out here with heavy equipment and put in a new septic tank and a new system. So that tore up a lot of the ground. So it's already torn up. We might as well stir it up and make a garden out of it, right? And I use my donkeys. In fact, I've got some videos up of my donkeys pulling harrows and tools like that to work the ground as a person might with modern farm equipment. We use them for farm transportation. Probably the busiest tool on a typical small farm is a four-wheeler. People get out on their four-wheeler and run all over the farm and do this, do that, do the other thing. But we do all that with donkeys. Uh, I've got a two-wheel cart. I've got a wagon. I can haul a lot of stuff. One of my staffers last week needed to move a bunch of old steel cattle panels down to where we store them, and she took the donkey wagon, and did it that way. Um, when we harvest, we always use the donkeys. We just go around and hand harvest. Uh, so I can't yet mow with them. We've got a horse-drawn hay mower, and my farm manager has draft horses and big mules, so she can bring her horses over here and we can mow with them. But I've had a dream for years of designing and building a smaller mower. The deal is donkeys aren't my team of donkeys weighs 500 pounds apiece. So that's 1,000 pounds. Well, when I had my draft horses, they weighed 1,500 pounds apiece. So two draft horses weigh 3 times as much as two donkeys, and they can pull twice as much, and they walk faster because they have longer legs. So, some of the machinery that I need doesn't exist, and we have to invent it, and some of it we haven't gotten invented yet. But it keeps us busy.
Fascinating, fascinating stuff. A lot of I'm taking notes as you're talking, and there's a lot of thoughts that come to mind. One is a story that I wrote about while I was researching for my book Bright Green Lies, which is a critique of renewable energy and what I see as greenwash solutions to the environmental crisis that we're facing, electric vehicles and so on. And we connected originally through some of that critique of electric vehicles as a solution. But the story that I tell in that book is how back in the late 1800s, when the car was first being introduced in the United States, it was perceived as a solution to the to a pollution crisis, which was taking place in American cities at the time due to the booming of these cities, the proliferation of industry and commerce. There were so many horses, donkeys, and other draft animals in American cities that there was poop all over the place, for one. And they were treating these animals so badly that in many cases they would actually just die on the street and then sit there and rot. And, that would lead to disease issues and so on. It's fascinating to me because that was perceived at the time, the automobile was perceived as a solution to a crisis that the community was facing. Now, in the book, we tell that story as a cautionary tale about electric vehicles and how so often technological evolution doesn't end up solving a pollution crisis or an ecological problem. It simply displaces it. It changes the nature of it in some way. It creates new problems of its own. And I'm sure there are people listening who would probably say, Jeff, I don't believe this, but probably who would say, Jeff, that's great that you're doing it. That's cool, but it's anachronistic. It's small scale. That can't be scaled up to the society that we have today in the world. Now, I have my own response to that critique that I could say, and I will after you say yours, but I want to get your thoughts on that to people who say that you're just a romantic who is doing a small scale, personal change thing.
First, let me say that the way I found out that Max Wilbert existed was by buying Bright Green Lies, and it's in my library. And I've always felt that the too much poop on the roads excuse is pathetic. There is not a farm in the world that doesn't need fertilizer. Now, I read every day, every week, that we can't live without the Haber-Bosch process. If there's too much poop on the road, somebody should go out and scrape it up and take it out in the country and dump it on the field. I mean, that's not hard. You wouldn't have to expend it. My donkeys make poop because that's what they do. A difference between donkey poop and horse poop, or I mean, and car poop, is that car poop is inherently toxic. If you stand behind a car and breathe their poop, it will kill you. If you stand behind a donkey and breathe their poop, it won't. And not ever. Nobody has ever committed suicide by locking themselves in a garage with an idling donkey. And as far as the scale, I think that's the most important point I was trying to make earlier. The assumption that we will be able to maintain these scales forever, I find that to be completely unsupportable. Our scales are maintained by high energy fuels. And the day that the high energy fuels go away, the scale will be how far you can walk in a day. That's it. There's no two ways around it. This is not, as I read, people who are concerned about the climate and modern people who are quote on my site unquote. I get the impression that most of them assume that the surface speeds by which we live will be available forever. I actually remember before the surface speeds by which we live were available. I was 9 years old when the interstate highway law was passed. By the time there was a significant number of interstate highways in the country, I already had a driver's license. The city I grew up in, the Kansas City I grew up in, 35 miles an hour was fast. I was as fast as anybody ever went. And the scale of the city was defined by the 35-mile-an-hour norm. And now the scale of the city is defined by a 65-mile-an-hour norm, which is 55-mile-an-hour speed limit plus 10. And that's all well and good, except for two little problems. One is which that we have created climate change. I mean, if the world had stayed like the world when I was 16 and 35 miles an hour was an average speed, you can look at the charts of fuel consumption and emissions and see how they've shot up. I turned 16 in 1963. So you can see how they've shot up since 1963. Yes, we would have climate change if we lived in a 35-mile-an-hour world, but nothing like we have now. No comparison, absolutely none. We wouldn't have a tenth of the climate change that we have now because to double speed requires 4 times the energy, and the whole it hasn't worked. You can see that it hasn't worked. When I was 16, 17, 18 years old, you drive up and down the 70-mile-an-hour highways in rural Missouri, and there was just roadkill everywhere. Not much roadkill left. We killed them all already. And the fact that the life I live is a small scale life, I take that as an acknowledgement of the reality within which we will have to live. I don't think I'm old fashioned. I think I'm ahead of the game. I have a video on my YouTube channel. By the way, my YouTube channel is Jeff the Donkey Guy at YouTube. So I have a video on my YouTube channel where I picked up a man and his son hitchhiking, or not hitchhiking, just walking. And we were talking, and he said, "Well," the son said, "Well, it's just like the old days." And I said, "Yeah, maybe. I think it's the future." And I do. I don't think we have the choice to go on like we are. I think that's a false assumption.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm reminded, Jeff, of a story that I heard when I moved into the neighborhood that I live in now, rural neighborhood. I live about a similar distance outside of Eugene, Oregon, something like 10 miles, 8 or 10 miles outside of the edge of town. And when I moved into the rural neighborhood I lived in, I heard a story from an old timer who said that his neighbor who was in his 90s at the time grew up in that area, and he used to ride a donkey into town on a little narrow 1-lane dirt road that is now a 2-lane paved road on which people go. The speed limit's 45, people go 55, 60, as you say. And before that road even existed, there were, of course, native people in the area, Kalapuya people, and they traversed this area. There's camas bulbs, which are a native plant bulb, important food source, oak trees, hunting areas, access to streams and rivers to the south and to the north and to the west that have salmon. At the time, had very high salmon populations, steelhead, elk herds out in the area, deer herds, bear, all sorts of wildlife, food sources, medicinal plants, and so on. And they traversed all those areas on foot, of course, at foot speeds. And so it's just fascinating to me because this area was colonized really starting in the 1850s, seriously. And so within 175 years, you have this transition that you're talking about from foot speed, which, if you're walking for a good chunk of a day, 2 miles an hour is a good speed. That's pretty good to maintain for quite a while, right? And now we're at 55. And of course, this speed issue translates into the entire economy and thus the entire society, because it's a globalized economy now, where the same speed that drives our individual transportation is the speed that brings Amazon packages around the world, that drives container ships across the ocean at speeds which were impossible in the age of sail, let alone before that. It's the same speed that animates so much of the global economy. So I'm just agreeing with everything that you said about how this speed issue is, in some ways, it's not, in my view, it's not necessarily the cause or the underlying issue, but it's a proxy for it. It's rises in direct relationship with the acceleration of the destruction of the planet, the pollution crisis, the rise in plastic pollution and chemical pollution, the falling of the forests, the destruction of soils and erosion, and so on. So, but the other point that I wanted to make too, Jeff, because I think that you were talking about this being the future, this way being the future, slowing down, having a more human scale, a smaller sphere of life. And I think you're exactly right. And one thing that has been seen throughout history for anyone who's studied history is that when we see the collapse of civilizations take place throughout time, whether we're talking about, the Roman Empire, whether we're talking about, all kinds of different Chinese dynasties, the Egyptians, the Mayans, what you see is generally people moving from a highly complex society with a lot of labor specialization and much higher energy consumption, or the proxy for it in more ancient times, which would have been forest consumption, soil consumption, the consumption of other quote unquote natural resources. You see people shifting from that to these simpler, lower energy ways of life, because those are the resilient ways. Those are the ways that you can count on. And people in this culture sort of got a very miniature taste of that during COVID, of course, and now with this new Ramadan war playing out with the attack on Iran and rising fuel prices. Again, it's sort of in miniature. It's very small scale, but people are able to see to a small extent that if they're dependent upon these industrial supply chains on the other side of the world, and those systems are both inherently fragile and inherently destructive to the basis of all life really on this planet, then it's inevitable that those systems will fail at some point. And those who will be more resilient, more able to weather those shifts, will be those who can fall back on lower energy, more simple, more local ways of life, and actually support themselves and their communities with those ways of life. I'm thinking about the Amish, who you mentioned. I'm thinking about a guy named David Lauterwasser. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but a writer on Substack, Animus Ramblings, who wrote an amazing piece recently. His wife is Thai. And he wrote an amazing piece recently about these villages in rural, I believe, northeastern Thailand, very rural, and they're living in basically a traditional way for that area. Even today, I mean, he just wrote this quite recently. Those communities are the ones who are going to be most resilient to ecological shocks, for one, because they're protecting and enhancing the land around them as much as possible. So there's built-in resiliency there. And simply because of the skill set and the community that they're building.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take exception with one of the things you said early on in that I acknowledge that speed is not the sole source of all our problems, but I would submit to you that speed is an absolute linchpin without which we could not have created most of these other problems. In 150 years ago, everybody in the whole world lived within walking distance of what they needed to get through the week. Everyone, whole world. Because the only way to get was either walk on your own feet, walk on your horse's feet, and your donkey feet. There was no option. And so everyone lived walking distance of all their basic needs. And one of the first things that Britain had to do after the steam engines came in and altered the textile industry was they had to dig the canal, because it comes in two flavors. One flavor is velocity. How fast does a thing move across the surface? But the other flavor is tons per mile per day. Before the steam mills came in, the steam woolen mills came in, all woolen mills, all textile production was fully served by local fiber production. all the weavers in a given community drew their wool from all the wool farmers, and they drew their flax or their linen from all the flax farmers in their community. And the way that stuff got moved around from place to place, if you needed a big load of wool, you loaded it on a horse wagon and they hauled it across 10 miles a day. Well, when the mills got to their demand for wool was higher, so it had to come from farther away. A horse wagon had to go up hills and down hills and through the ruts, and it could only carry about 10 tons. So they built the canals. One horse could pull 40 tons. So all of a sudden, you've got 4 times as much speed in terms of material motion, mass in motion. And the believe me, I stopped driving the speed limit 40 years ago. We haven't covered that at all, but I never drive over the speed limit anytime, ever, anywhere. And the only time that I go the full speed limit is when I consider myself to be in an emergency, and that comes typically once to twice a year. Aside from that, I drive either 5 miles per hour below the speed limit or up to a maximum of 55 miles an hour every day. And over the 40 years, it has reduced the scale of my life because if, people say, people don't talk about how far someplace is away in miles. If you're sitting there in rural Eugene and somebody says to you, how far is it to Grants Pass? Somebody else is going to say, oh, it's 3 hours. Okay. They're not going to say in miles. They're going to say it's 3 hours. Okay. Well, if Jerry's driving, it's 4 hours. And when every time you know that you leave the house, you're going to be investing that much of your day, you have to have a better reason to go all those miles. And so it has literally reduced the scale of my travels that I only drive 55. And overall, I see, I've been advocating slowing for years. I don't know how much of my stuff you've read, but I've been advocating this in writing since 2018. And if we slowed, people think that's all about fuel mileage. Okay, so if you slow down from 70 to 55, you're going to get an improvement in mileage, and that's so much improvement. Well, in 10 hours at 70, you can go 700 miles, and in 10 hours at 55, you can only go 550 miles. So if you didn't get any improvement in fuel mileage, you would still use significantly less fuel at 55. You just have to. You can't go as far. And ultimately, we're not filling up the atmosphere with CO2 by the mile. We're filling it up by the day. So if we burn less fuel per day, then the rate at which we fill up the atmosphere with CO2 will automatically go down. All of a sudden, now that the Ramadan war has been begun, nations are talking about imposing speed limits. It's only been a month, and nations are talking about imposing speed limits. We've had, 28 COP meetings? And in 28 COP meetings, nobody has ever proposed reducing speed limits, not one, because speed is the linchpin. If we reduce surface speed, we will automatically force degrowth. We will automatically force a reduction in GDP because at lower speeds, you can't move as much materials as far. You can't move as much finished product as far. And until you get it from the mine to the smelter, to the field, to the factory, to the store, to the consumer, to the landfill, the less material you can move, the less you can mine, the less you can burn. So speed is not the sole cause, but it is an absolute limiting factor, an absolute linchpin.
Yeah, very well said. Thanks for that, Jeff. I appreciate it. And I think I agree. I think we're actually on the same page about that. Yeah, what you're writing about, what you just said rather, about how the Ramadan war has already forced this reduction in consumption that hasn't been seen. That's what I wrote about in a recent piece, of course, is how this war, although not designed, of course, at all by either the United States or Iran as any sort of environmental or climate action. Both are petrostates and, both seem to have a full commitment to expanding and exploiting all the fossil fuels in their territory and so on. The result, nonetheless, seems to be a reduction by something like 15 to 20 million barrels of oil burned per day. And that in itself is it's been 5 weeks of the war now, and that has had a positive climate impact, reduction in carbon pollution, reduction in emissions on a scale that the environmental movement has not achieved in my lifetime. Now, of course, we could look at, there's another thought experiment that we shared in Bright Green Lies that I think is relevant here as well, which was the question, we posed the rhetorical question, is it better for the planet if our cars get 100 miles per gallon or 1 mile per gallon? And we argued counterintuitively that if our cars got 1 mile per gallon, it would be far, far, far better for the planet, because if it costs you, right now, $5 or something along those lines to go 1 mile, then you're not going to drive at all, probably. Again, unless it's an absolute emergency, there's a huge disincentive that's created to driving in the first place. And that has ripple effects throughout. That's going to disincentivize the creation of more roads and highways. That's going to disincentivize long distance industrial forms of trade. That's going to disincentivize all the activities, industrial activities, destructive activities that rely on transportation of goods and materials. Like you said, mining, industrial agriculture, all these types of things, they could only look incredibly different. They would be fundamentally transformed if the vehicles that are involved in those processes only got 1 mile per gallon. And we were making that argument in the book to say that efficiency, which is often regarded as an inherent good in environmental circles, is very much a double-edged sword. It very much depends on what the intention behind that efficiency is. And in capitalism, in industrial society in general, across the world, almost all efficiency is done with the intention of allowing more speed, allowing more consumption, allowing more production, and very little efficiency is done with the intent of actually reducing consumption. So, for example, folks talk about how, use all parts of an animal if you hunt an animal, right? How that's the respectful thing to do. That's a form of efficiency in some ways. Yet at the same time, I'm a hunter. And, after you're done with the animal, bring the meat back home to feed the family, bring the hide back home to use for making things. There's lots of stuff left over. There's the guts of the animal, the viscera, some of the bones, things along those lines. And those will be recycled into the land. Different animals will eat them. Birds will eat them. Scavengers, coyotes, ravens, squirrels will chew on the bones. The calcium will go back into the soil. That's a natural sort of efficiency. And the goal there isn't necessarily to maximize production or consumption or speed. But again, if you look at cars that get 100 miles per gallon, you'll take that thing anywhere and you'll drive it fast. Right? Because it doesn't cost much to run. It's cheap to run. And that's something that I believe we're seeing with the push towards electric vehicles is a lack of awareness of this issue, where the reality is that, yes, electric vehicles appear to be, I've read the articles and analyzed the numbers to some extent. I'm not an engineer, but for all intents and purposes, they appear to be far more efficient from an energy perspective than a fossil fuel vehicle. And they're certainly cheaper to run from what I understand, depending on if you have battery failures and so on. But from an ecological perspective, that creates more incentive for driving. That's going to further entrench car culture. It's going to push people to go further and go faster. It's going to create more momentum in the industrial system as a whole. And so, yeah, I bring that story up because I really appreciate your work I have read a bunch of your articles over the years, and I really appreciate that you're pushing a counterpoint to this. And it's heartening to me in some way, despite the fact that we're not seeing transformations. We're not seeing thousands of people picking up Jeff McFadden as their guru and adopting his techniques en masse. Um, but it's heartening nonetheless that you get so much positive response out on the roads, because I think at a gut level, people really understand that this modern way of life is totally screwed up and isn't going to last. And people, like you said early on in this conversation, feel trapped. They feel like they don't have the ability to change. They don't have the skills. They don't have the community around them. They don't have their parents and their grandparents teaching them how to breed donkeys, how to raise donkeys, how to build carts, how to produce their own food from the land, how to restore the ecology and assist the ecology in flourishing around them. Those skill sets just don't exist. Instead, kids are being taught how to code and how to use AI and things along these lines, which to me are stuck in the old paradigm, as you were saying earlier. And I guess, Jeff, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this or reflections on this, and maybe then we'll move towards closing up the conversation. But I'm reminded in some ways of how many years ago, when I first got involved in environmental work, I was studying global warming and really becoming aware of the crisis that it is. I was learning more about deforestation and soil erosion and these other ecological problems. And I was young. I was like 14 reading about this stuff at a time when climate change was barely on people's radar. There was no coverage of these issues in the mainstream press. And I didn't have much power as a young kid, but what I could do was ride my bike. And so I started, I decided I was going to try and ride my bike everywhere and change my personal behavior, and also try and convince other people to do the same. And over the years that followed, I kind of ran up against the limits of that, or the challenges to that, in that we live in a car culture, and it's really difficult for a lot of people to change that. And so I'm wondering if you could just reflect on this difficulty, this tension between the fact that people love what you're doing, they're inspired by it, and that very few people are able to, or feel they're able to adopt it and change the way they live. And your thoughts on to what extent the changes that we're likely to see in the future will be things that we deliberately do, choices that we make, versus things that are forced on us by changing circumstances, or a mixture of the two.
I'll come back to that final question in a minute, but I want to go clear back to the beginning of what you just said and discuss efficiency. I don't know if you have read my recent essay about efficiency, but the word itself is overused and misused in our culture. When we say efficiency, what we mean is more stuff per person hour. Efficiency cannot exist without a reference. We are going to be efficient in some term. We're going to get more production or better production in some term. And Jevons paradox says that the more efficient we become, the more crap we will use. Basically, that's kind of about that's a little crude, but nevertheless. But for instance, if we looked at total energy efficiency to the point where if we could do something with no fuel at all, it would be preferable to doing it with less fuel. Okay, then you can't increase the amount of fuel via Jevons paradox if the objective is no fuel. You Jevons paradox would lead you to doing more things with no fuel, and that's part of what my objective has been. Another point you brushed over, a lot of the reason that I started driving animals in public was merely to prove that it is possible. People don't believe it's possible. And people say, you can't do that. Well, watch me. Just watch me. I'm going to go out here and do it. And uh, so that's all. Could you go back and repeat the last thing you asked me to cover? I've kind of lost my place. I'm not hearing you.
I was asking you about the fact that there's this tension between people really appreciating your work and feeling that they don't have the ability to follow in your footsteps or your cart tracks, so to speak. And to what extent you think the future that we're moving towards, a lower energy, more localized future, do you think that that future will come about as a result of deliberate choices that we're making, or as a result of unintentional or unavoidable collapses in the industrial system that we rely on now, or perhaps a combination of the two?
Personally, of course, I can't see the future, and once again, if you do read things I write, you know that I say that all the time.
Right.
It's an important fact to me. Um, but based on the responses that I've received to 8 years of writing Slow Down, I'm gonna say that there is no possibility that we can do it on purpose.
Hmm.
The number of people who have just brutally attacked me
Mm.
for suggesting that we could a lower speed, lower energy life is indescribable. And we're never going to slow down until we're forced to. And that's really unfortunate because I'm going to take a little circle here, if you'll forgive me. I know we've got a lot of time in it already. Part of the reason that I've advocated slowing is I've advocated recurrent slowing. That is to say, next year we all slow down 5 miles an hour. The year after that, we all slow down 5 miles an hour. We do that for 10 years and nothing goes faster than a running horse.
Right. That's how you actually shift the culture, is not all at once. Ideally, if you're going to do it deliberately, you need some
Lay it
time
out.
to change.
Yeah, I've got essays which lay it out in detail. It
Yeah.
could be done. But with each slowing, we would have to develop systems to serve our needs from smaller scale. We would have to. And like, if every climate change believer in the United States, which is supposed to be roughly two-thirds of us, slowed down to 55 miles an hour on the interstate, everybody else would too, because you can't go any faster than the car in front of you. And that's a side point. But if we had built, say we had done that, then now when we run out of gas or when we're limited in gas for 6 months, okay, it wouldn't be a big deal because food would be available locally and toilet paper would be available locally and screws would be available locally and nails and hammers. But as it is, we have done nothing for that, nothing to move in that direction. And therefore, when the energy to maintain this high speed system goes down, I'm afraid that it would probably result in mass death if we
Right.
did it on purpose and we
Mm.
keep all 8 billion of us. I can't prove that, of course, because nobody's done it. But I think we could by permaculture systems and regenerative and ecosystem building systems. I think we could get a huge amount of food out of the natural systems that Earth operates on. But I don't think we're going to because the idea speed is just thrilling. Think about it. Why did humans invent the swing? Why did humans invent the high dive? Why did humans invent the zip line? All these things are because speed is physically thrilling. We don't have a name for the sense of increasing the kinetic energy within our bodies, but we feel it and we like it. We feel that energy and we can't stop it. People get stuck behind me on a highway and I'm going 50 and the speed limit is 55. They'll just blast around me if the stop sign is only 1,000 yards ahead. The time they're in front of me, they're already on the brake, but they've got that little speed rush and they can't live without that speed rush. So I don't think we're going to do it. Now, I have learned something that most people will never learn, and that's the joy of traveling slowly through the earth on which I live and seeing every plant and seeing every bird and hearing every song. Most people will never experience that. That's the thing that keeps me going back to my donkeys is I can leave here on a donkey cart and I can have an experience that is more pleasant than most people get by going on vacation to Hawaii. But they'll never know that. They'll never experience it. And I Personally, I don't think we're gonna slow down until we're forced to, and when we do, I think it's gonna take out at least half of us.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems likely to me as well. One example that I wrote about not too long ago is how Jason Hickel, who's a prominent academic within the degrowth movement, wrote a piece for the Monthly Review, which is a sort of Marxist socialist periodical, about how the degrowth movement embraces industrial technology. And the example that he gave was high-speed trains. It's quite interesting to me because trains these days are perceived as being highly efficient and ecological way to travel. But if you look at the history of rail transportation, you talked about the canals. Well, the next thing that came was the railroads, right? And they facilitated industry, logging, mining, extraction of natural resources, industrial agriculture, and settler colonialism itself on a scale that had never been even dreamed about before. The railroads were really the linchpin of the shift from a more agrarian, small scale, slower society to a modern industrialized society. And so it was very interesting to me conceptually that that's the example that Hickel gave in that piece was high-speed rail and how the degrowth movement should embrace high-speed rail for the future. I also believe that we, at least those of us in the United States, appear to be headed for that uncontrolled collapse. Look at the current administration, look at the Biden administration, look at all the previous administrations. They basically had a policy of pedal to the metal when it comes to industry, to speed, to resource extraction. Of course, Biden extracted far more oil than Trump did during his first term, if you compared the two. And that is an uncomfortable reality, to say the least. It is a rough thing to grapple with. It's very challenging for many people to look at, because I think many of us who want environmental change, who want to solve the climate crisis, who see ecological issues as a priority, we're generally nice people, and we believe in people's goodness and ability to make the right decisions when armed with the correct information. And yet, of course, as I've written about quite a bit, we don't actually live in a democracy in this culture. If you look at policy versus public opinion, basically what the American people think about policy has zero influence on whether that policy gets passed or not. Whereas what economic elites think has a large influence on whether policies get passed or not. So we don't live in a democracy, and yet many of us, and I would say the mainstream environmental movement for certain, has built a politics that's entirely based on an assumption that we do live in a democracy. And that assumption to me seems to be wrong. And then on top of that, you have what you talked about, Jeff, about this sort of addiction to speed itself. The issue I mentioned with the degrowth scholar, the fact that so many people seem to think that the entire scale of the problem that we're facing comes down to, let's build a bunch of solar panels and all switch to electric vehicles and everything will be fine. So I don't see that transformation happening in a deliberate and but at the same time, I guess the hope that I hold out, Jeff, and maybe you'll agree, is that for the most part, from my study of history, collapse seems to be a relatively fast process, but not instantaneous, right? It plays out over years, over decades, sometimes over centuries. With the speed of ecological change that we're seeing now, that timeline is probably accelerated quite a bit. But my hope is that those communities, those people like you, folks who are engaging in these types of social change, can represent seeds that, as collapse intensifies and as these industrial systems become less and less reliable, and as more and more people become desperate because of that, there is at least some model for people to turn to for alternative ways to live. Like you, I don't see that spreading rapidly throughout the whole culture or leading to a wholesale shift in how we live, but rather sort of being these these alternatives, living alternatives that are able to grow and expand in the face of crisis. As you know, I know you've read some of my work. A big part of my work has been on the resistance side of things, making the argument that because each day that goes on with the global industrial economy continuing to function as it does, there's more carbon in the atmosphere, more forests logged, more fish vacuumed out of the ocean, more soil lost, more pollution emitted, more plastics, more PFAS, and on and on and on. That actually the longer it takes, the longer that collapse gets pushed out into the future, many people think that if we can just stave off collapse for long enough, we'll have this sort of transformation in how we live. It seems to me that the opposite is the case. The longer that collapse is pushed out into the future, the worse the underlying ecological conditions will be, and the less people will be able to survive. The less we'll be able to sort of muster a positive future for children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren moving forward. And that theory is obviously based on a series of assumptions and observations. It's certainly debatable, but I think that, like you said, going back to the COP conferences and the fact that people have supposedly been working on global warming, on all these other ecological issues for decades, and yet we're far, far worse off now than we were when the first COP conference happened. That's my diagnosis of where we're at, and I think we share some overlap, at least some of those ideas.
Yeah, we agree about that. Your last statement, we agree totally and completely. I would mention that philosophically I should support degrowth, but the reason I don't support the degrowth movement, and particularly don't support Jason Hickel, is twofold. One is that he assumes that a degrowth economy will continue to be a high-speed, large-scale economy. And I believe that the speeds and scales within which we live are themselves destructive and cannot be maintained in a healthy world. I also think that a problem with degrowth is the general plan seems to be, first, you have a national agreement on what thing to degrow and how to degrow it and what thing to do less of. I would go the other way. Put in less energy and then see what you can do without it. And then put in even less energy and see what you can do without that. Once again, by slowing. I would also say, in terms of what our collapse is going to look like, just a kind of a little story. If you imagine yourself standing in front of a concrete bridge above, and you're 10 feet away from it. Now, you can walk 10 feet forward and walk into that bridge abutment, and it won't hurt very bad. If you back up 10 feet and you run into that bridge abutment, it's going to hurt a lot. Well, what's the difference in the pain? The energy. The energy transfer from the kinetic energy in your body to stopping. That energy transfer will be destructive. And finally, what if you run into that bridge abutment at 70 miles an hour? Well, strawberry jam. And I think we're going to run into the bridge abutment at 70 miles. I think it's going to be ugly. Personally, at my age and my general condition, I wouldn't bet that I would survive it. On the other hand, I've had a really good run. The thing that nobody knows about spending 41 years living in the sticks and driving horses and donkeys and walking around the land and sticking trees in the ground is that you could not possibly have a more comforting, more satisfying, happier life than I've had. So the fact that I'm old and I'm reaching the end, that's okay. It's been wonderful. It's just been wonderful. And I look at all the people out there, they don't look that happy to me. I wouldn't trade with any of them. Not now. I wouldn't trade with any of them.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to celdf.org. That's celdf.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.